Section 23 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 2, Jewish Heroes and Prophets, by John Lord. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. St. Paul, Part 2. The relations between Paul and Barnabas had been thus far of the most intimate and affectionate kind. But now the two apostles disagreed. Barnabas wishing to associate with them his cousin Mark, and Paul determining that the young man, however estimable, should not accompany them because he had turned back on the former journey. It must be confessed that Paul was not very amiable and conciliatory in this matter, but his nature was earnest and stern, and he was resolved not to have a companion under his trying circumstances who had once put his hand to the plough and looked back. Neither apostle would yield, and they were obliged to separate. Reluctantly, doubtless, Paul choosing Silas as his future companion, while Barnabas took Mark. Both were probably in the right and both in the wrong, for the best of men have faults, and the strongest characters the most. Perhaps Paul thought that, as he was now recognized as the leading apostle to the Gentiles, Barnabas should yield to him, and perhaps Barnabas felt aggrieved at the haughty dictation of one who was once his inferior in standing. The choice of Paul, however, was admirable. Silas was a broad and liberal man who had great influence at Jerusalem and was entirely devoted to his superior. The first object of Paul was to confirm the churches he had already founded, and accordingly he began his mission by visiting the churches of Syria and Cilicia, crossing the Taurus range by the famous Sicilian Gates, one of the most frightening mountain passes in the world, penetrating thus into Lycaonia and reaching Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. At Lystra he found Timothy, whom he greatly loved, modest and timid, and made him his deacon and secretary, although he had never been circumcised. To prevent giving offense to Jewish Christians, Paul himself circumcised Timothy, in accordance with his custom of yielding to prejudices when no vital principles were involved, which concession laid him open to the charge of inconsistency on the part of his enemies. Expediency was not disdained by Paul when the means were unobjectionable, but he did not use bad means to accomplish good ends. He always had tenderness and charity for the weakness of his brethren, especially intellectual weakness. What would have been intolerable to some was patiently submitted to by him, if by any means he could win even the feeble, so that he seemed to be all things to all men. No one ever exceeded him in tact. After Paul had finished his visit to the principal cities of Galatia, he resolved to explore new lands. We find him, after a long journey through Mysia of 300 miles, traveling to the south of Mount Olympus at Troas, near the ancient city of Troy. Here he fell in with Luke, a physician, who had received a careful Hellenic and Jewish education. Like Timothy, the future historian of the Acts of the Apostles was admirably fitted to be the companion of Paul. He was gentle, sympathetic, submissive, and devoted to his superior. Through Luke's suggestion, Renan thinks, Paul determined to go to Macedonia. So without making a long stay at Troas, the four missionaries, Paul, Silas, Luke, and Timothy, took a ship and landed at Neapolis, the seaport of Philippi, on the borders of Thrace at the extreme northern shores of the Aegean Sea. They were now on European ground, the most healthy region of the ancient world, where the people, largely of Celtic origin, were honest, earnest, and primitive in their habits. The travelers proceeded at once to Philippi, a city more Latin than Grecian, and began their work, making converts, chiefly women, among whom Lydia was the most distinguished, a wealthy woman who traded in purple. She and her whole household were baptized, and it was from her that Paul consented against his custom to accept pecuniary aid. While the work of conversion was going on favorably, an incident occurred which hastened the departure of the missionaries. Paul exorcised a poor female slave, who brought, by her divinations and ventriloquism, great gain to her masters; and because of this destruction of the source of their income, they brought suit against Paul and Silas before the magistrates, who condemned them to be beaten in the presence of the superstitious people, and then sent them to prison to put their feet fast in the stocks. The jailer and duumvirs, however, ascertaining that the prisoners were Roman citizens, and hence exempt from corporal punishment, released them and hurried them out of the city. Leaving Timothy and Luke at Philippi, Paul and Silas proceeded to Thessalonica, the largest and most important city of Macedonia, where there was a Jewish synagogue in which Paul preached for 3 consecutive Sabbaths. A few Jews were converted, but the converts were chiefly Greeks, of whom the larger part were women belonging to the best society of the city. By these converts the apostles were treated with extraordinary deference and devotion, and the church of Thessalonica soon rivaled that of Philippi in the piety and unity of its converts, becoming a model Christian church. As usual, however, the Jews stirred up animosities, and Paul and Silas were obliged to leave, spending several days at Berea, and preaching successfully among the Greeks. These conquests were the most brilliant that Paul had yet made, not among enervated Asiatics, but bright, elegant, and intelligent Europeans, where women were less degraded than in the Orient. Leaving Timothy and Silas behind him, Paul, accompanied by some faithful Bereans, embarked for Athens, the center of philosophy and art, whose wonderful prestige had induced its Roman conquerors to preserve its ancient glories. But in the first century Athens was neither the fascinating capital of the time of Cicero nor of the age of Chrysostom. Its temples and statues remained intact, but its schools could not then boast of a single man of genius. There remained only dilettante philosophers, rhetoricians, grammarians, pedagogues, and pedants, puffed up with conceit and arrogance, with very few real inquirers after truth, such as marked the times of Socrates and Plato. Paul, like Luther, caring nothing for art, and the thousands of statues which ornamented every part of the city seemed to him to be nothing but idols. Still he was not mistaken in the intense paganism of the city, the absence of all earnestness of character and true religious life. He was disappointed, as afterward Augustine was when he went to Rome. He expected to find intellectual life at least, but the pretenders to superior knowledge in that degenerate university town merely traded on the achievements of their ancestors, repeating with dead lips the echo of the old philosophies. They were marked only by levity, mockery, sneers, and contemptuous arrogance. Idlers were they, in quest of some new amusement. The utter absence of sympathy among all classes, given over to frivolities, made Paul exceedingly lonely in Athens, and he wrote to Timothy and Silas to join him with all haste. He wandered about the streets distressed and miserable. There was no field for his labors. Who would listen to him? What ear could he reach? He was as forlorn and unheeded as a temperance lecturer would be on the boulevards of Paris. His work among the Jews was next to nothing, for where trade did not flourish there were but few Jews. Still, amid all the discouragement, it would seem that Paul attracted sufficient notice, from his conversation with the idlers and chatterers of the Agora, to be invited to address the Athenians at the Areopagus. They listened with courtesy so long as they thought he was praising their religious habits, or was making a philosophical argument against the doctrines of rival sects; but when he began to tell them of that cross which was to them foolishness, and of that resurrection from the dead which was alien to all their various beliefs, they were filled with scorn, or relapsed into indifference. Paul's masterly discourse on Mars Hill was an obvious failure, so far as any immediate impression was concerned. The pagans did not persecute him; they let him alone; they killed him with indifference. He could stand opposition, but to be laughed at as a fanatic and neglected by bright and intellectual people was more than even Paul could stand. He left Athens a lonely man without founding a church. It was the last city in the world to receive his doctrines, that city of grammarians, of pedants, of gymnasts, of fencing masters, of playgoers and babblers about words. As well might a humanitarian socialist declaim against English prejudices to the proud and exclusive fellows of Oxford and Cambridge. Paul, disappointed and disgusted, without waiting for Timothy, then set out for Corinth, a much wickeder and more luxurious city than Athens, but not puffed up with intellectual pride. Here there were sailors and artisans, and slaves bearing heavy burdens, who would gladly hear the tidings of a salvation preached to the poor and the miserable. Not yet was the alliance to be formed between philosophy and Christianity. Not to the intellect was the apostolic appeal to be made, but to the conscience and the heart of those who knew and owned that they were sinners in need of forgiveness. Paul instinctively perceived that Corinth, with its gross and shameless immoralities, was the place for him to work in. He therefore decided on a long stay, and went to live with Aquila and Priscilla, converted Jews, who followed the same trade as himself, that of tent and sail making, a very humble calling, but one which was well patronized in that busy mart of commerce. Timothy soon joined him with Silas. As usual, Paul preached to the Jews until they repulsed him with insults and blasphemy, when he turned to the heathen, among whom he had great success, converting the common people, including some whose names have been preserved: Titus, Justius, Crispus, Chloe, and Phoebe. He remained in Corinth 18 months, not without difficulties and impediments. The Jews, unable to vent their wrath upon him as fully as they wished in a city under the Roman government, appealed to the governor of the province of which Corinth was the capital. This governor is best known to us as Gallio, a man of fine intellect and a friend of scholars. When Sosthenes, chief of the synagogue, led Paul before Gallio's tribunal, accusing him of preaching a religion against the law, the proconsul interrupted him with this admirable reply: "If it were a matter of wrong or moral outrage, it would be reasonable in me to hear you; but if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such matters." He thus summarily and contemptuously dismissed the complaint, without, however, taking any notice of Paul. The mistake of Gallio was that he did not comprehend that Christianity was a subject infinitely greater than a mere Jewish sect, with which, in common with educated Romans, he confounded it. In his indifference, however, he was not unlike other Roman governors, of whom he was one of the justest and most enlightened. In reference to the whole scene, Canon Farrar forcibly remarks that this distinguished and cultivated Gallio flung away the greatest opportunity of his life when he closed the lips of the haggard Jewish prisoner whom his decision had rescued from the clutches of his countrymen. For Paul was prepared with a speech which would have been more valued, and would have been more memorable, than all the acts of Gallio's whole government. While Paul was pursuing his humble labors with the poor converts of Corinth, about the year 53 A.D., a memorable event took place in his career, which has had an immeasurable influence on the Christian world. Being unable personally to visit, as he desired, the churches he had founded, Paul began to write them letters to instruct and confirm them in the faith. The apostle's first epistle was to his beloved brethren in Thessalonica, the first of that remarkable series of theological essays which in all subsequent ages have held their position as fundamentally important in the establishment of Christian doctrine. They are luminous, profound, original, remarkable alike for vigor of style and depth of spiritual significance. They are not moral essays like those of Confucius, nor mystic and obscure speculations like those of Buddha, but grand treatises on revealed truth, written as it were with his heart's blood, and vivid as fire in a dark night. In these epistles we see also Paul's intense personality, his frank egotism, his devotion to his work, his sincerity and earnestness, his affectionate nature, his tolerant and catholic spirit, and also his power of sarcasm, his warm passions, and his unbending will. He enjoins the necessity of faith, which is a gift, with the practice of virtues that appeal to consciousness and emanate from love and purity of heart. These letters are exhortations to a lofty life and childlike acceptance of revealed truths. The apostle warns his little flock against the evils that surrounded them, and which so easily beset them, especially unchastity and drunkenness, and strifes, bickerings, slanders, and retaliations. He exhorts them to unceasing prayer, the feeling of constant dependence, and hence the supreme need of divine grace to keep them from falling, and to enable them to grow in spiritual strength. He promises as the fruit of spiritual victories immeasurable joys, not only amid present evils, but in the glorious future when the mortal shall put on immortality. Especially and repeatedly does he urge them to have also that mind which was in Christ Jesus, showing itself in humility, willingness to serve others, unselfish consideration of others, even the preference of others' interests before their own, a combination of the homely practical with the divinely ideal, such as the world had never learned from any earlier philosophy of life. Paul at last felt that he must revisit the earlier churches, especially those of Syria. It was 3 years since he had left Antioch, but more than all he wished to consult with his brethren in Jerusalem, and to be present at the feast of the Passover. Bidding an affectionate adieu to his Christian friends, he set out for the little seaport of Cenchrea, accompanied by Aquila and his wife Priscilla, and then set sail for Ephesus on his way to Jerusalem. In his haste to reach the end of his journey he did not tarry at Ephesus, but took another vessel and arrived at Caesarea without any recorded accident. Nor did he make a long visit at Jerusalem, probably to avoid a rupture with James, the head of the church in that city, whose views about Jewish ceremonials, as already noted, differed from his. Paul returned again to Ephesus, where he made a sojourn of 3 years, following his trade for a living, while he founded a church in that city of necromancers, sorcerers, magicians, courtesans, mimics, flute players, a city abandoned to Asiatic sensualities and superstitious rites, an exceedingly wicked and luxurious city, yet famous for arts, especially for the grandest temple ever erected by the Greeks, one of the seven wonders of the world. It was in the most abandoned capitals, with mixed populations, that the greatest triumphs of Christianity were achieved. Antioch, Corinth, and Ephesus were more favorable to the establishment of Christian churches than Jerusalem and Athens. But the trials of Paul in Ephesus, the capital of Asia Minor, the most celebrated of all the Ionian cities, more Hellenic than Antioch, more Oriental than Corinth, more wealthy than Thessalonica, more populous than Athens, were incessant and discouraging, since it was the headquarters of pagan superstitions and of all forms of magical imposture. As usual, he was reviled and slandered by the Jews; but he was also at this time an object of intense hatred to the priests and image makers of the temple of Diana, troubled in mind by evil reports concerning the converts he had made in other cities, physically weak and depressed by repeated attacks of sickness, oppressed by cares and labors, exposed to constant dangers, his life an incessant mortification and suffering, killed all the day long, carrying about him wherever he went the deadness of the crucified Christ. Paul's labors in Ephesus were nevertheless successful. He made many converts and exercised an extraordinary influence, among other things causing magicians voluntarily to burn their own costly books, as Savonarola afterward made a bonfire of vanities at Florence. His sojourn was cut short at length by the riot which was made by the various persons who were directly or indirectly supported by the revenues of the temple, a mongrel mob, brought to terms by the tact of the town clerk, who reminded the howling dervishes and angry silversmiths of the punishment which might be inflicted on them by the Roman proconsul for raising a disturbance and breaking the law. Yet Paul with difficulty escaped from Ephesus and departed again for Greece, not however until he had written his extraordinary epistles to the Corinthians, who had sadly departed from his teachings both in morals and doctrine, either through ignorance or in consequence of the depravity which they had but imperfectly conquered. The infant churches were deplorably split into factions, the result of the visits from various teachers who succeeded Paul, and who built on his foundations very dubious materials by way of superstructure. Even Apollos himself, an Alexandrian Jew baptized by the Apostle John, the most eloquent and attractive preacher of the day, who turned everybody's head. In the churches women rose to give their opinions without being veiled, as if they were Greek courtesans. The agape, or love feasts, had degenerated into luxurious banquets, and unchastity, the peculiar vice of the Corinthians, went unrebuked. These evils Paul rebukes, and lays down rules for the faithful in reference to marriage, to the position of women, to the observance of the Lord's Supper, and sundry other things, enjoining forbearance and love. His chapter in reference to charity is justly regarded by all writers and commentators as the nearest approach in Christian literature to the Sermon on the Mount. Scarcely less remarkable is the chapter on death and the resurrection, shedding more light on that great subject than all other writers combined in heathen and Christian annals, one of the profoundest treatises ever written by mortal man, and which can be explained only as the result of a supernatural revelation. Paul's second sojourn in Macedonia lasted only 6 months. This time he spent in going from city to city, confirming the infant churches, remaining longest in Thessalonica and Philippi, where his most faithful converts were found. Here Titus joined him, bringing good news from Corinth. Still there were dissensions and evils in that troublesome church, which called for a second letter. In this letter he sets forth, not in the spirit of egotism, the various sufferings and perils he had endured, a few of which are alluded to by Luke. Of the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have spent in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils of rivers, in perils of robbers, in perils from my own race, in perils from the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in toil and weariness, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, besides anxiety for all the churches. Section 24.